Dave Surdam is with us, and fascinating man, associate professor of economics at the University of Northern Iowa, and turns out some terrific books. Wins, Losses, and Empty Seats, The Post-War Yankees. We're going to talk today about Run to Glory and Profits, the economic rise of the NFL during the 1950s. The University of Nebraska Press has published all these books. Dave, how have you been doing? It's good to catch up with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me back on the show again.
Tell me about this latest effort, new from the University of Nebraska, Run to Glory and Profits, the economic rise of the NFL during the 1950s. Tell me what you're writing about here, Dave.
Well, I wanted to investigate how the NFL went from being second banana at best and rather obscure at worst right after World War II to becoming pretty close to being the preeminent professional sports league in America. And that happened during the post-war period, and probably by the late 1960s, you could argue that the NFL is on a par with Major League Baseball, if not more popular.
What did you
wanted to investigate how they did that.
How did they do it? What did you discover?
Well, I think the key thing to remember is they had a very attractive product. I'm not a particularly big football fan. I do watch the games quite a bit, but the owner took a lot of effort in trying to make the game more appealing, and that included speeding up the action so there were more plays per game, trying to encourage passing so there was more scoring and more aerodynamics, and those were sort of the main things that they had control over and everything. So they thought about that quite a bit, and as I said, they created a very appealing product, and some historian will argue that it was perfect for the time because you had sort of this organizational man and everything was organized, and they talked in terms, they'd been through a war, so all these sort of warlike terminology in football worked out pretty well. And the New York, the media seized onto the New York Giants from time to time, and that certainly provided them quite a bit of publicity and everything.
And then the wonderful phrase, on any given Sunday. Oh, I remember that well as a kid growing up.
Yes, they certainly touted that. I'm not sure. Are you, what were you, teenage in late 60s, early 70s?
Yeah, in the 50s. No,
50s, okay, so you're a little bit older than I am, but they did begin to hype the fact that they consider themselves to have better competitive balance than Major League Baseball. And that's true and it's not true.
What do you mean?
If you look at the standings, they certainly had their teams over, let's say, between 1950 and 1960. They had their teams that were consistently sporting losing records, such as the Washington Redskins, Chicago Cardinals. Then they had a team such as the Cleveland Browns that had just one losing season during those 11 years. And in fact, it was only a 5-7, and they bounced back. Typically, the Browns were in the playoffs at the end of the season. Paul Brown did a wonderful job. He's got to be one of the great professional coaches in any league. And he mentioned that in 1946, when he started out with the All-American Football Conference, that he had a goal that he apparently did not publicize, probably because he didn't want to be confined to an insane asylum or something, of winning 10 division or conference championship, not necessarily the league champions, but winning his division, as it were. And he actually succeeded. That I think is a pretty remarkable feat.
Oh, it is. Tell me about the role that television played, David.
Oh, sure. Can we back up a bit? And
Please.
Let me talk a bit. Otherwise, we'll go through all the topics a little too rapidly, and I'll run out of things to say. I find it interesting with Paul Brown. He's sort of a fascinating character. In some ways, I guess he's somewhat like Joe McCarthy of the Yankees, that they insisted on a certain professional decorum among the players, and it was very businesslike. And in fact, he probably took it further than McCarthy did, because Brown made it very explicit that he didn't want them losing at all. And there's the one famous incident where I believe they lost a game in San Francisco, and he basically said, if you guys don't care any more than this, or if you don't want to play any better than this, you can go on down to Los Angeles and go to, I don't know if it was Disneyland or some place, and they had scheduled a little junket. But he was so angry, he thought the players should focus on on the fact that they had lost a game, and he also said that if they didn't start shaping up, he was going to get rid of some of these people. Now, mind you, he had a veteran team, and about 8 or 9 players were pretty much there for an entire decade, including Otto Graham, Marion Motley, Bill Willis, and the other people that are probably older than we are would remember from the Browns. So he ran a very tight ship, but he was also a very innovative person. He certainly was willing to reintegrate the AAFC with Marion Motley and Bill Willis, and of course they turned out to be Hall of Fame players. So he was certainly progressive in some sense, even though he was somewhat autocratic, let's say. Mm-hmm. But it's impressive that he had that core of 8 or 9 players for 10 years, and he won championship after championship with that. And probably Otto Graham was the key because he was the quarterback. When Graham retired, Brown never won another championship, even though he had Jimmy Brown. But he just never was able to win the championship again. But that's a pretty remarkable run.
Yeah, amazing. Absolutely amazing. Now, let's get to television, David, and the role that it played in the rise of the NFL during the 50s.
Right. The owners, as with people in baseball and later in basketball, couldn't decide whether they thought that televising home games was beneficial or not. Many of the owners thought that if they televised the game, especially in football, because sometimes in the later part of the season the weather's nasty, and if you could watch the game on TV, maybe you'd just stay home. During one of the congressional testimonies, one of the owners actually admitted that he himself had stayed home to watch the game on TV because the weather was bad. So they were somewhat worried about that. On the other hand, they hoped to get some sort of television rights, but they decided on somewhat of a compromise that most of the teams would not televise home games to the local audience. And, of course, that eventually becomes part of the blackout rule that people are familiar with that was very controversial for a number of decades and everything. But they struggled with television, and they weren't really sure if television was going to be a friend or not. Early on, they took a vote, and this is something that's not particularly well known. In the League Minute, they took a vote on whether they were going to share the local television revenues equally and put it in kind of a common pool, so to speak, and share it just as they would eventually do with the national television money. But they voted that down, so it was never obvious that they really wanted to share the money equally, because some of the teams did get roughly double or sometimes triple the amount of television revenue that, let's say, the Green Bay Packers, usually the team that got the lowest because they're in a very small television market. Of course, you're familiar probably with the fact that they eventually got that national television contract with CBS in the early 60s. And that was not quite as revolutionary as it might appear, because the AFL beat them to the punch. And, in fact, the AFL got a national contract before they even took the field. For the AFL, it made them a little bit more formidable as a competitor, because it meant that they had a few $100,000 coming in for every team guaranteed, and that kept them going, even though the initial year or two their gate attendance in the AFL was not particularly profitable. So television was kind of an interesting situation. It turned out that, from another point of view, the owners in the NFL were not particularly altruistic by having the equal shares plans, because only one team actually lost money by doing it that way. Everybody else gained. So presumably, unless it was requiring unanimity, the other owners could vote it in. Nobody had to sacrifice much. And so that's just another aspect of, it's not altruism that's driving this. You do have a strain of thought that the NFL, compared to the Major League Baseball, the NFL owners are more altruistic or more farsighted or whatever, but I really don't see a lot of evidence for that.
What did you learn about the importance of revenue sharing in the league?
Revenue sharing is interesting in the National Football League. Some of the historians claim that the National Football League had a much more generous revenue sharing than Major League Baseball during the 50s, and that was one of the reasons why the league prospered. There's that's somewhat of a distortion. First of all, even though it seemed pretty simple to say that the NFL 60-40 split, where the home team kept 60% versus 40% going to the visiting team, that's somewhat of a misnomer, because the home team got to take 15% off the top for stadium rental, and that left just 85% of the money that was going to be shared. And then the league took 2 or 3%. ultimately what it meant was that the visiting team got 1/3 of the revenue, so it's not quite as generous. 1/3 of the revenue for the visiting team was roughly double what the Major League Baseball owners shared with visiting teams. But the football people had a second stipulation, and there was a minimum guarantee. You had to pay out $20,000 per game throughout the 50s. A team such as the Chicago Cardinals were such a bad draw that oftentimes they had to pay the minimum. So in actuality, they were paying a higher proportion of their gate receipts to visiting teams than the wealthier teams did. So it was somewhat similar to a regressive tax in the sense that the more you make, the lower your percentage. So in the NFL, the less you made, the higher the percentage. And that somewhat goes against this idea that they were altruistic again. It basically, I presume if you were the Cleveland Browns team and you brought your team to play the Chicago Cardinals, you wanted that minimum $20,000 because otherwise you just sacrificed one of your road games for a lousy take. And so that's probably why they had the minimum. But the minimum does reduce the effectiveness of the revenue sharing.
My guest is David Surdam, and he is speaking with us from the campus of University of Northern Iowa. So glad he's with us. His book is called Run to Glory and Profits, The Economic Rise of the NFL During the 1950s. We've got more with David. One more segment on Inside the Game. We do it every weekend on WORL AM 660 in Orlando. And I'm Pat Williams, and stay with us, please. David Surdam is with us. His book is called Run to Glory and Profits, The Economic Rise of the NFL During the 1950s. David, talk about the role of the reverse order draft.
Sure. The reverse order draft, of course, as most fans realize, it's supposedly designed that the last shall be first, so to speak, to steal from the Bible. The idea, of course, is that a last place team getting the first round, the first pick, might improve. Now, economists are somewhat dubious about how this is going to play out because presumably, if that player pans out, eventually it's likely that he might get traded to a team that has a greater revenue potential. And we saw that, of course, in basketball because Jabbar, Shaquille O'Neal, and Wilt Chamberlain, they all moved to bigger cities eventually in their careers. That's somewhat true in football, although given the turnover in football, it's hard to say whether that's true. The more interesting point of the draft, however, was that in the 1950s, some of the teams didn't pay much attention to the draft. In fact, my guess is some of your fans out there in the days leading up to the NFL draft actually spend more time looking at the players, even though they don't go to the training camp, but they probably spend more time thinking about it than those owners did back in the 50s. They have anecdotal stories about how owners or coaches would call their buddies on draft day and say, well, we need a tight end. Who would you recommend? And there's a great quote by one of the owners who picked Gary Glick as a number one pick for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Later, the owners quoted, or the coaches quoted as saying, we'll never draft a player again that we haven't seen. So, I mean, that's just completely unfathomable today that you draft somebody that you've never actually seen play or seen film of. So that's somewhat indicative of the hit or miss approach that some of these owners took. Early in the draft, when they first implemented it back in the late 30s, when Burt Bell put it in, the idea, of course, was the Pittsburgh Steelers back then were a pretty lousy team. He wanted to have a chance at some of these better players, but he couldn't bid on them in the open market because the Giants and the Bears would beat him out. So he said, well, let's put in this draft. And he basically, I believe the first year of the 9 people he drafted, nobody signed with him. And that's because in the early years, football didn't pay well enough that a lot of these people, they were college educated. In fact, that was a selling point for the NFL. We have these college educated players, and they had opportunities that were pretty competitive with playing professional ball. So a lot of these people said, I'm not playing professional ball. I'm going to start my career. And it was not uncommon for many of these owners not to be able to sign half their draft picks. Now that slowly changes so that eventually by the 50s they're signing the majority. But clearly, if you can't sign a lot of these players, it really wipes out the whole purpose of having a reverse order draft. My guess is that the real reason they like the reverse order draft was that it gave an owner sole bargaining power over the player, and therefore probably kept the player salaries down. The other thing that's rather amusing in the 1950s, which belies the argument that they're using this draft to help the weaker teams, is that some of the wealthier teams, such as the Bears and the Giants, wanted to have an occasional turn at getting the number one pick, the first player of all, so they included a bonus pick. So there were 12 teams. Over the course of 12 years, each team randomly got to pick the number one pick overall, and then they went to the last place team. So this was called a bonus pick. If you look at the bonus pick, you might think, well, if I've got the number one pick, I should always get an all-star player. And in fact, only 3 of the 12 ever made All-Pro, including Paul Hornung and Chuck Bednarik. But most of these people were complete bust. And it's interesting to think that they just weren't good enough at picking these players to make the reverse order work as well as you would think. And that's rather fascinating because it raises questions about the role of scouting. And they actually interviewed 3 of the top college coaches during the hearings, and they were talking about this reverse order draft. And the 3 coaches said, we don't think we could even pick the top player. Yeah, it's a little bit stunning because, of course, today these players are scrutinized to a high degree, and their intelligence is tested, the 40-yard dash, everything tested, and maybe overkill on that. But back then it was somewhat hit or miss. They were just beginning to start investigating these players a little more. Some of the owners also were smart enough to realize that there was quite a bit of talent at the well, I guess back then they would have called the Negro colleges, but the African-American colleges. And they started signing players. They didn't typically have to draft them because nobody else was looking at them. And you have several Hall of Fame players such as Emlyn Tunnell, Night Train Lane, and who's the other one? Oh, Big Daddy Lipscomb. Those are great names. Mm-hmm. They're very colorful names, and I'm sure if you talk to people that are 70 or 80 years old, they'll remember those names. But all 3 of them made the Hall of Fame, but none of them were drafted, and they all went to smaller African-American colleges. So a few of the owners were looking at those players, that pool, but most of them weren't. And that takes us, of course, to integration. The NFL in the 1920s did have African-American players, including, I believe Paul Robeson was in there, and some other people. But then in the 30s, they just phased them out. It's not really clear why. Some people believe that George Marshall, the owner of the Redskins, got rid of them. But right after World War II, Paul Brown, as I had mentioned earlier, signed Motley and Willis. The NFL was forced to, when they sent a team into Los Angeles, the Coliseum said, well, you can play here, but you have to have some black players. So they hired Woody Strode and Kenny Washington, who had played alongside Jackie Robinson. So these people actually integrate the NFL before Robinson really gets going in Major League Baseball.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Marshall turned out to be, and this is germane today because Marshall had the team in Boston, and I guess playing on the fact that it was a baseball Boston Braves, he called them the Boston Redskins. Then he moved to Washington, and he had this song that he liked, Hail to the Redskins. And people who think that they chose the name to honor the name Redskins, I find that rather dubious because you listen to the song, it's completely idiotic. I'd play the lyric, I'd repeat the lyric, but I suspect most people find them highly offensive because they have something about scalping them and blah, blah, blah. It's just a ludicrous song. But he's the last owner to integrate his team by about 5 years. And he just sits there saying, well, if I could find a good black player, I'd hire them. Nobody's going to give me one. A lot of my fans are from the South, and we only look at players from the South, so we're not going to find any black players, and so on. So he doesn't really integrate until, I believe, it's 1962 when he gets Bobby Mitchell. And he lucks out on Bobby Mitchell because Bobby Mitchell turns out to be a Hall of Famer and helps improve the team. But the Redskins were pretty dormant during the 1950s, and the sports writers were beginning to make fun of them because they refused to hire black players, and they were saying, well, that's probably why the Redskins are picked for last this year. They don't have black players on their team. So it's rather interesting. I don't think that there's any evidence that Marshall particularly was honoring any ethnic group by using the Redskins. So when they talk about that today, I find that a very dubious argument.
In closing, David, we got about 3 minutes. Talk about
Sure.
strife between owners and players. What was going on in that department?
Sure. The owners were well aware that the reserve clause and the almost immediate release or the ability to automatically release a player without paying them more than about 10 days' salary, they had been warned in the league meetings that this might not stand up in a court of law because there wasn't any reciprocity there. It was all one way. So they changed the word subtly in there to make it appear that if you played out your option year, so you were reserved for a year, and then the team had an option on you for the second year. And if you played that one out without signing a contract, theoretically you were a free agent. It turned out that when they were grilled on this by Congress, who a lot of the congressional leaders were pretty dubious about this, they thought it was just almost tantamount to a perpetual reserve clause such as Major League Baseball had. They asked Burt Bell and some of the owners, well, can you name some free agents, people who actually became free agents? And they had a lot of difficulty coming up with anybody that was actually a free agent. So it was pretty dubious that their little change in the wording had any real content to it. The owners, as with owners across the other sports, typically pretty paternalistic and maybe patronizing to some degree. They weren't sure the players would spend any money that they received wisely. They referred to the players as boys. Burt Bell, throughout his testimony, consistently referred to the NFL players as boys, which irritated some of the Congress people. But he pointed out, and partly in defense, that he was considerably older than the players. So I guess it was okay for him to call them boys, but I think that was endemic of the way they thought of these players. So when the players started trying to come up with an association, the owners, of course, most of them thought it was a terrible idea. In the 1950s, they basically compared it to communism or socialism, which in the 1950s was not a very savory thing to be associated with. So it's basically the same story as you had in the other sports. Anytime you had the reserve clause and the owner had that kind of power, and then you had a draft, it did tend to lead to abuse, probably in a sense. But I'm glad that I don't operate under that kind of a system as an employee.
My guest has been David George Surdam, and we've been talking about his new book, Run to Glory and Profits, the economic rise of the NFL during the 1950s. David, thanks a million for joining me, and it's fascinating to talk to you always.
Oh, well, you're very welcome.
I'm Pat Williams. Please visit my website. It's patwilliams.com. The Twitter page is Orlando Magic Pat. My most recent book is out. It's called The Leadership Excellence Devotional. It's in bookstores now and up on Amazon.com as well. We are back next week for more on Inside the Game, WORL AM 660 in Orlando. Thanks for listening. Have a great week ahead. Good job, sir. Thanks, David, very much.
Thank you. It came across clearly enough.
Oh, you were crystal clear. And,
good. Well,
always real good to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I wish you well on your book.
Thank you, David. Take good care. Merry Christmas.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.